Thank you for joining me. So, I'm not an economist, but I have been reading quite a lot of the headlines this week about pay and yet more strikes, which has got me thinking. So, this is not going to be a usual post from me, perhaps a little heavy, but I'm therefore going to ask you to be generous with me as I work through my thoughts on the topic and forgiving if I get stuff wrong. I equally don't really have a plan for this, so I'm not sure if I'm going to end up with the answers, but let's see how we go. So let's start and take a look at the facts, well, the facts anyway, according to the government statistics. So if we ignore an anomaly when we returned from the pandemic, pay in the UK has risen at the fastest pace for over 20 years, rising at 6.4% between September and November. However, that 6.4% average increase actually breaks down to 7.2 in the public sector and only 3.3% in the public sector, 7.2 in the private. Unemployment remains at a historical low, and job vacancies, whilst falling slightly, still remain at a historic high. Inflation, as we know, is at 10.7%, showing that the continuing rate in which prices are increasing, which in turn is driving the cost of living crisis that we're experiencing. The government's plan is to halve inflation this year, and the Bank of England has obviously risen or raised interest rates in an attempt to support that. So with all this context, with a labour market with low unemployment and high vacancy numbers, it favours the employee. It's hard to recruit, and so with rising rents and fuels and costs, employers may need to offer more pay to attract people. Where there is a high demand for labour, you also potentially have to offer more to retain the talent that you have. So these market forces will drive up pay rates. Although, as a side note, I do appreciate that this picture is not reflective for everybody right now, with an increase in redundancies too. So, having been involved in numerous pay negotiations with various trade unions during my career, I can completely understand the argument they will be making. And this is obviously resulting in the current pay deadlock and the industrial action that we're currently seeing. So, if we take the case of the public sector as a whole, as an example, then if pay in this area has increased by 3.3%, as the figures suggest, then this is clearly not keeping up with the rising prices at 10.7%. So represents a real pay terms cut of 7.4%. And that's before you then take into account any historic underinflation pay increases, which may have compounded the issue further. So hence the union's asking for a double-digit pay awards, which is what we're seeing. However, whilst I understand this argument, having sat on the employer's side of the table all my career, I cannot help but wonder how all this is paid for. Most businesses I've worked for operated on a margin anywhere between 5% and maybe 20%. And clearly businesses are not immune to the hyperinflation either. So their costs will be increasing too. The cost of fuel, utilities, etc. will be already eating into that margin significantly. And with the wage bill often being the largest chunk of a company's operating expense, a further 10% on there and the margin's potentially gone altogether. So the only way to survive as an employer in that case is to increase your prices, as it's hard to reduce your costs when they're all rising, unless you do something really drastic. Yet if you increase your prices, then there is an argument to say that we're compounding the continuing high inflation world that we live in, and so where does it stop? Now, this is, I believe, what the argument the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, made last summer when he said, if everybody tries to beat inflation, and that is both in price setting and wage setting, it doesn't come down, it gets worse. If inflation becomes embedded and persistent, it gets worse. So if employers cannot afford double-digit pay increases without increasing prices, and in doing so compounding the inflation, the employees, especially those on lower pay, cannot afford to keep up with spiralling prices, how do you square that circle? How do we bring an end to the strike action across rail, postal services, transport, nursing, and now teaching? However, it does seem, to be fair, not all economists agree with this outcome and suggest resisting giving fair pay increases and increasing poverty is actually likely to accelerate the onset of a recession. So with all of this, what is the answer? And from CIPD research last year, it seems offering improved flexibility and extending remote working are being used to attract candidates. However, this doesn't resolve the pay talks. Clearly, good industrial relationships are key, and being open and transparent about what can be afforded and the consequences of overstretching costs. Looking at solutions like remote working, which save on travel costs, financial support packages in education, well-being, increased flexibility, and perhaps one-off lump sum payments through this period without increasing the ongoing costs can form part of an overall solution, which is the approach I believe Lloyd took last year. And this kind of expands the conversation beyond just pay, and maybe that helps. But in my research, perhaps not unsurprisingly, I haven't found a magic wand. So I'd love to know what you think and what your businesses or what your unions are doing to resolve the apparent and understandable loggerhead we seem to currently be in. Thank you very much for listening.